When I first started building my cabin, it never occurred to me that I could get a sawmill and make my own lumber. It wasn't even a thought in my mind. I had no idea that that was something that you could do. I mean, I guess I'd probably heard about those kind of things, but I'd worked in construction, you bought your lumber, you built stuff, that's what you did. It never occurred to me to get my own sawmill. Then back in early 2010, a friend of mine's buddy, who I guess knew a little bit more about that kind of stuff than I did, said, hey, you know what? You got a bunch of trees out there. Why don't you get a chainsaw mill and start making your own lumber? Well, I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. I never thought of that. So I got online, like probably you've done, and I started looking at chainsaw mills and how they worked, and I was pretty impressed. I thought, wow, right? You fall a tree, get your chainsaw with a chainsaw mill attachment and run down the log and you make lumber. And I thought, well, why not? I had actually just bought a chainsaw, a brand new chainsaw, because the one that I had was kind of like a camp saw. It was a little 16-inch Craftsman that my wife bought me for my birthday, I think when I turned 40. But I realized that out there at the property, when we just started out, that there were some bigger trees there, that it would be much better to have a little bit bigger saw. So I went out and spent $500 on a Husqvarna 455 Rancher. That's like a 52cc saw. By the way, it has been a great saw. I still have it today. I still use it today. You probably have seen it in some of my sawmill videos if you've seen some of those. Since I was now really getting into the idea of trying to make my own lumber, I went ahead and I bought a Granberg small chainsaw mill attachment. Simple, very easy to put on the saw. You get some 2x, you make kind of a ladder, run the saw down the ladder to make your cap cut, and then you can take the ladder off and start making your next cuts. So I started running a chainsaw. Now at the time, I still hadn't planned on really doing a lot of milling, but I thought, hey, if I could make some paneling boards or something like that, why not? Especially because I had some dead trees. You could mill those up. Let's go do it. And so over the course of almost a year, I started trying to chainsaw mill logs into lumber. And I actually milled quite a few. I don't remember how many, but more than a dozen, probably less than 2 or 3 dozen, but I milled up several logs. And it took a long time. It was a lot of work. And then I realized that using a chainsaw mill wasn't going to get me the lumber I needed for paneling, for example, in a very expeditious manner. It would take an awful long time for me to mill up enough lumber to make paneling for the inside of my cabin. So I went and looked at buying some knotty pine, some tongue and groove knotty pine, and it was going to cost me about $5,000 to get that for the interior of the cabin. And at the time, I was a member of the forestry forum where I had learned about chainsaw milling. And I would go on there and ask all kinds of questions. And I learned a ton from those guys, and that was when I was first introduced to bandsaw mills. And Wood Miser was having a sale on their LT10, which was the smallest bandsaw mill they had. Just a little mill, I think it was a 14-foot track with a 7-horse motor. You know, I think the max log size was maybe 24 inches. The max width of a cut was maybe 18 inches, something like that. And the price of that mill at the time on sale was $3,500 delivered with 10 bands. A lot cheaper than buying knotty pine, and then you still have a sawmill. So I bought that sawmill and used it to mill a ton of paneling, as well as a lot of 2x, 2x4s, 6s, 8s, 10s, 12s, you name it. And I really kind of got hooked on the idea of milling. And then if you've seen any of my other sawmilling videos, I eventually progressed into an LT40 hydraulic sawmill, another Wood Miser product. And I ended up doing that as a business for a while. I was very, very active in remote sawing. So I would drive my sawmill out into the woods somewhere and spend a weekend milling up logs for people. And I milled up somewhere north of 300,000 board feet of lumber for other people. Of course, at the time, I wasn't getting a lot of milling for myself done or cabin work done, and that is a hazard with buying a sawmill. I always say that it's like the mechanic that has the crappy car because he never has time to fix it up because he's fixing everybody else's. Well, I was the guy that had a cabin that wasn't getting finished because he was out milling up logs to lumber for people to make their cabins. So that's it. I wanted to give you a little background into my sawmilling journey. It all started because of the cabin. And today, that's why you see that sawmill out there. And I talk a lot about running my sawmill. I have not been running it a lot lately. So this video is probably a surprise to some of you who maybe are just new subscribers and you've been watching my off-grid power or power station stuff. Well, the truth is, Everything on my channel is really all about my off-grid cabin and what I do and how I make things work there. And sawmilling is a very, very integral part of my cabin journey. So what's the point? Well, in this video, I want to talk about sawmills and what kind of sawmill you should consider if you're looking at buying a sawmill to help you build your cabin in the woods. So let's talk sawmills. There are a number of kinds of sawmills out there, and I'm not going to go through every sawmill. For one thing, I don't have experience on all of them. I do not have experience on circle mills, on swing blade mills, for example, like the turbo sawmill. I don't have experience with those. I've seen them operate, I've seen guys use them. I know they do a fairly good job. In fact, some argue that they're better in many regards than a band sawmill. I personally like band sawmills, and so that's mostly what I'm going to talk about. But I do want you to know that there are circle saws out there that are very portable, that work very well. And a lot of the bigger sawmill operations that usually start on a small sawmill and progress to, say, LT70s, which is the big wood miser portable sawmill. But it's not uncommon to see guys that have both circle mills and band sawmills, or chainsaw mills and band sawmills. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I do want to talk about the different kinds of sawmills to help you decide, if you want to buy a sawmill, what's the best option for you. Now, first of all, I think it's important to understand your needs for what you want to buy. Because you can go out and buy anything, and if you've got tons of money, you can buy the biggest, baddest, best sawmill in the world. But is it really what you need? So first of all, since I'm going to talk mostly band sawmills, if you really want to look at circle mills, there are great channels out there that have circle mills that talk about using them, and I would encourage you to go out and search those out. But the first thing that I always tell everybody when it comes to looking at buying a sawmill is how much money you're going to spend. What's your budget like? Because that's actually really important. Sawmills range from uber cheap Harbor Freight models to the Cadillacs, like the LT70 super hydraulic wides and bigger, right? You've got Baker Mills and turbo sawmills, and there's so many brands, Woodland Mills, Hudson, lots of brands of sawmills out there. And I think the first thing that you've got to do is you've got to be honest with yourself. How much money do you really want to spend on a sawmill? If it's just about building your cabin, if that's it, and you're not building the Taj Mahal of cabins, you're just building a little cabin in the woods, maybe one like mine, or 20 by 30 or something like that. Nothing major, but you want to be able to mill your own lumber, your own beams, your own paneling, all that kind of stuff. What are you going to do for log handling? Because one of the things about running a sawmill is you're milling logs, and logs are heavy. A decent sized saw log, say something 24 inches in diameter and 16.5 feet long, that log could weigh 2,000 pounds. So it's important to understand, how are you going to get those logs to your sawmill and then get them on your sawmill once you get them there? That's actually really important. So for example, I started with an LT10. It was on the ground. It laid down some 4x4s, screw that sawmill down to the 4x4s with some lag bolts, make sure it's nice and level, and away you go. And with a mill like that, as long as you can roll the logs to the mill, then you can roll the logs up onto the mill. So you don't need a tractor, a forklift, a skid steer, or anything else to get those logs on the mill. But you still got to get them to the mill. In my case, I had a Jeep, but that was an awesome rig, and I actually used that like a skidder. I would haul it out into the up into the trees and drag logs down to my sawmill, and I used the winch on it to winch logs up hills and all kinds of stuff. But again, I had to have a means of getting my logs from the forest where I cut the trees down over to my sawmill. Now, of course, you also got to have a big enough chainsaw to be able to cut those trees down and buck the logs up. But a 52cc Husky 455 Rancher was perfect. Once you get the logs to the mill, then it's easy. Roll them up, start milling them. But you got to also think about room. You're going to have slab piles, and you're going to have flitch piles, and you're going to have lumber piles, and all kinds of things. So you got to have some room. But as long as you've got room and means of getting the logs to the mill, the next question I would ask is, how much are you actually going to mill? Do you really need the LT40 hydraulic, or the LT40 hydraulic wide, or super hydraulic, or LT50 or whatever? Do you really need that big monster mill? Those are production mills. And those mills are really made, at least in my opinion, for the guy that wants to go out and run a business, either full-time or part-time, sawmilling for other people. Because those are fairly high production sawmills. An LT40 like mine can mill 500 board feet per hour or even more. That's quite a bit. Now, a lot of people will say, I don't know, I've never got that on one of those mills. Well, it's important to note that when manufacturers say that you can get, say, 500 board feet an hour on a mill, they're talking about if you've got perfect logs and you got a crew and you got equipment to move them and everything else. As long as the sawyer is only milling the logs and that's all they've got to do, somebody else is bringing them to the mill, somebody else is getting the wood off the mill and all that kind of stuff. Well, yes, you absolutely can mill 500 board feet an hour. But do you need to do that to build a cabin? And I would argue that you do not. As much as I love my LT40 hydraulic, you don't really need that to build a cabin in the woods. Now, here's a little caveat. If you're a little bit older like I am, especially if you've got maybe a bad back, shoulders, arms, whatever, then the hydraulic sawmill certainly makes a huge difference. It makes life much easier. So if you can afford a hydraulic sawmill, I would certainly be looking at one, at least the LT35, which is a great little sawmill. Not quite as heavily built as the LT40, but still quite capable. And if you go look at Northwest Sawyer's YouTube channel, that's all he runs. And he's put a lot of logs through that mill, a lot of big ones too. So those LT35s, which probably run about 10 grand cheaper than the LT40, they're a great sawmill for somebody who wants hydraulics and is building a cabin in the woods. But if you don't need hydraulics, well, there are some other options. For example, on the Wood-Mizer line, you now have the LX series, like the LX25, the LX50, and then you've got the LT15, and it comes in a few different iterations. For example, you can have an LT15 start, you can get one that's battery powered, you can get one that has a motorized head control so that the head will drive back and forth by motor, or you can push them, or you can crank them. And then you've also got Hudson mills like Two Brothers Outdoors YouTube channel uses. They've got a couple different Hudsons. They actually got a new one recently. Tim got one. And those are mills that you push. But those mills, they can produce a lot of lumber, and they're actually less expensive than, say, the LT15 or the LT35, the LT40 of the Wood-Mizer series. You've also got woodland mills, timber mills, you've got baker mills. There's lots of mills out there. But I want to look at dollar prices. So under $5,000, you're looking at a small band sawmill that sits on the ground that'll mill a reasonable amount, anything from, say, 150 board feet an hour to perhaps 300 or more, depending on the mill. You could take, for example, an LX25 with the biggest motor that they've got, or Hudson's smaller mills, and I'm not as familiar with the Hudson mills, or there's woodland mills, there's several of them out there, and you can actually produce quite a bit with those manual mills. It's just important to understand that you've got to roll the logs by hand, and you've got to get them to the mill and on the mill by hand. There's no hydraulics, there's nothing to help you lift the logs up or anything like that. And you're going to be bending over to pick up all that lumber off the log once you've milled it. But if you're looking for a mill under 5 grand, I'm going to tell you right now, I personally would stay away from the Harbor Freight brand. Sorry, Harbor Freight, but that mill, in my opinion, is not worth the money. I know lots of folks go look at them because they're inexpensive, but I would suggest to you that if you can't afford a step up from the Harbor Freights, for example, going to a Hudson or Woodland Mills product or a Wood-Mizer, then you might actually want to consider paying somebody else to come out and mill for you. To have somebody like me come out and mill for a weekend might cost you 2 grand, which is about what you're going to pay for the really inexpensive sawmills. But I just said that I can mill 500 board feet an hour on mine. Well, if you have me come out for a weekend, I can mill a lot of logs up in that time. The amount of logs I can mill up in a weekend on my big LT40 might take you a year to get on a little Harbor Freight, and you're probably not going to get very good lumber out of it either. Not to mention all the maintenance and bands and everything else you're going to have to run for it. So I would tell you right now that if you're thinking about getting a sawmill and you're looking at under $5,000, seriously consider going online and doing a search on Craigslist and FB and places like Wood-Mizer. Wood-Mizer has the pro sawyers list. You can go find a sawyer in your neck of the woods that will come out, and they will charge you either by the board foot, which is usually maybe around 50 cents a board foot, or they could charge you by the hour like I did. I was $100 an hour. And you might think $100 an hour, but if you take your Jeep into the Jeep dealer, you're going to pay almost $200 an hour for the shop rate. And what's a plumber or an electrician cost you today? So $100 an hour is a steal on a sawmill. Let's say I do an average of 300 board feet per hour. In an 8-hour day is 2,400 board feet. That's 4,800 board feet in 2 days. 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, done. No problem. And I've done a lot more than that. I've done 8,000 board feet in 2 days. Depends on the logs and the crew. If you're willing to work hard and help the sawyer, they're going to get more produced. So that's number one. Under $5,000, if you're dead set on getting a sawmill, don't get the cheapest sawmill. Save up a little bit more. Get your Hudson, get your Woodland Mills, or get your Wood-Mizer. Get a better quality, well-known brand of mill and go that route, because it's going to be worth it in the end. That little LT10 from Wood-Mizer that I had, now this is back in late 2010 when I bought it. I didn't get it to my cabin until 2011, but I actually bought it, I think it was November or December of 2010. I milled a ton of lumber on that mill. I'd come home from work when I was living at the cabin, and I would just mill up for an hour. I could mill 100 board feet by myself easily in an hour, which might be 2 of the smaller logs, and then go have dinner. Doing that every day turns out a lot of lumber over the course of a year. Now, if you can afford a little bit more sawmill than that, I would tell you to take a very, very serious look at the Wood-Mizer LT15. I'm not sure what those run today. I'm gonna guess one with all the whistles and knobs is probably around 9 or 10 grand, but I think you can still get those between 5 and 7. So I would go look at the Wood-Mizer website, take a look at that mill. You get them, I think you can get them with a 19 horse or 24 horse motor. The biggest motor you can get's the better motor if you can. Or go look at some Hudson, Woodland Mills, Baker products that are of that same category. Let's say $5,000 to $10,000, and go look at those mills. And one thing you're going to have to consider is, what's the availability of that mill? If you order one today, can you have it by spring? Can you get it set up so that you can start milling as soon as the snow melts? That's something to consider, because I know for a while there, if you ordered an LT40, it would take you 1.5 years to get it. Well, they're in great demand. They're an awesome mill. But do I want to wait 1.5 years to get my sawmill? I certainly wouldn't have back in 2010. Or 2015, when I bought my LT40. Bought it in late 2015, picked it up in early 16. There's a bit of a pattern there, I guess. Now, if you're looking at something above the 10 grand range, I'm going to tell you, jump straight into something like the LT35 with hydraulic. If you can't afford hydraulics, I understand, and they do have models. All the companies have models that are almost there. They've got ramps and winches and things to get the logs up on the deck, and you can even use those to turn the logs. Having a log at waist height is much nicer than having it on the ground, I'll be honest with you. It's much easier to mill, no bending down, life is so much better. So if you're maybe below the $20,000 range, but you're above 10, you might be looking at, I think, the LT20, I think they have, or 25, or similar products from the other companies I've mentioned. And there are lots out there. So if there are other manufacturers out there that I haven't mentioned, just know that there's lots of them. I can't possibly remember them all. But now the question I have is, let's say you've got the money. You can afford that LT35 or LT40, and you can afford a tractor, a skid steer, something of that nature to bring those logs to the mill. You don't have to have one, because they do load their own because of the hydraulics, but it really does help, especially if you start milling beams and things like that. If you can afford all that, then I'm going to tell you, absolutely go with that LT35. LT40, if you can afford it, it's going to be a nicer mill. I just think that it's almost a waste having an LT40 if you don't use it very often, right? I don't hardly use mine right now because I'm broken, and I hate to see it sit there, because it's meant to be used. It's meant to get thousands of hours put on it. It's a production mill. But when it comes to building a cabin in the woods, it's important to take the time to figure out what is it you're really after. If you're just going to build one cabin in the woods and then you're going to be done, and you don't anticipate doing a whole lot of milling after that, then I would say don't spend maybe as much money on a sawmill. Try to get maybe something in that $5,000 to $10,000 range, because here's another interesting thing about sawmills. They hold their value, especially Wood-Mizers. Looking at it from the perspective of the cabin builder that's going to build one cabin and then be done with it, retire, call it good, I'm just going to hang out in my cabin and do nothing more. Well, I'm going to caution you right now. If you get a sawmill, you're going to run your sawmill probably more than you think. You're going to get a sawmill, and one thing's going to happen is all your neighbors are going to find out you have a sawmill, and they're going to want you to mill for them too. But realistically, if you go out and you buy yourself, let's say, an LT15, and yes, I'm a Wood-Mizer guy, so I'm going to talk more about their mills probably. But if you go out and you get one of those, mill all the lumber you could possibly need for your cabin, and then continue to use it because you'll have paid for it in the money savings of milling your own lumber. Or honestly, you could probably sell it pretty much for what you paid for it. In fact, I know today that if I were to put my LT40 up for sale, I'd probably get about 4 or 5 grand more than I paid for it back in late 2015. That's just the nature of the beast. They're like tractors. They hold their value. So let's kind of do a recap here. 1, budget, that's important. Can you afford the bigger mills and do you really need them is something to consider. 2, hydraulics. Are you someone that really needs the help moving those logs? Then get hydraulics. There is no beating hydraulics, folks. But the question from that comes, do you really need the LT40 or bigger? It's nice to have a Cadillac, but maybe the Lincoln can do just fine. So maybe look at that LT35 instead, unless you plan on making a living from it. Log handling is very important. Do you have a 4-wheel drive? Is that how you're going to get your logs there? Well, then you better have a debarker because they're going to be dirty. And yes, you can mill dirty logs, but without a debarker, you're going to run through bands a little more than you would when you have a debarker. And I won't mill without mine. I mean, sure, if I'm doing live edge slabs and I don't want to leave a groove mark in from the debarker, I won't use it. But I also know I'm going to run through bands quicker because a band running through dirt and rocks and things is going to dull very, very quickly compared to one that has a clean surface to mill through. That's what the debarker does for you. So I personally won't mill without one. And I started without one, but I learned that lesson with my LT40. Better. The next thing I think you really have to consider is that that lumber's not really ready to use the moment it comes off your sawmill. You actually should let it dry. And so you've got to learn how to properly stack and sticker and dry your lumber, as well as put anchor seal on the ends and put weight on it, keep it from the weather, but allow it to breathe. Never make the mistake of putting your green lumber in your garage and closing it up and thinking it's going to dry because it's just going to turn green. You need air movement to dry that lumber. So that's something that you really should consider. All in all, I will tell you the best sawmill for your operation is the sawmill that meets your budget, but isn't that really low-end El Cheapo sawmill that will produce at a rate that you need it to produce at. If you're okay with just milling 1 log a day or 2 logs in a day and not spending 8 hours a day to produce, 500 board feet of lumber, if you can just get away with 2 or 3 logs at a time and you're happy with that, you can get away with those little LX25s or the little Hudson mills or things like that. And sure, they could run for 8 hours a day, but can you? It's a very important question to ask yourself. When I first started sawmilling, I was in my 40s. I was still in pretty good shape. I was already a broken jarhead, but I was still in pretty good shape. I could physically do the work. It was good for me. Today, there's no way I would get a sawmill on the ground that's manually operated. As much as I loved my LT10, which I really did. I miss that sawmill. It's funny. In fact, one of you that watches my channel has one and another mill, and you love running that LT10 just like I did. It's a great little mill. So now you have the LX25, the LX50. Those mills can do it. You've got the Hudson mills, the Woodland mills. All those mills do really, really well. In that lower end category, they're not Harbor Freight mills. Don't get one of those. But if you can afford the bigger mills, definitely look at those and consider hydraulics if you need that help moving those logs around. Because I'm telling you what, even with hydraulics, if you're running a sawmill by yourself or with one other person and you're running it all day long, well, you better get in shape. Or you will get in shape because you're going to do a lot of walking, a lot of moving, a lot of stacking lumber, a lot of rolling logs, a lot of running a chainsaw. It's just part of the business. But if you take the time to do a little research, watch my sawmill videos, especially some of those old ones, you'll get an idea. But the last thing I would tell you is it's not just about buying a sawmill. You have to think about buying a sawmill as something that is just bigger than all that. By that I mean you actually have to learn how to mill a log. You can't just roll a log up and knock it down. Sure, it probably looks like that when you watch a lot of sawmilling videos, but if you do that, you're going to make inferior lumber. Your lumber's going to twist, it's going to bend, it's going to crown, it's going to cup, and you'll get good lumber out of just about every log anyway, but the difference is the percentage of good lumber you get. Someone who takes the time to learn, and I suggest Forestry Forum, if you haven't gone there and you're thinking about buying a sawmill, I absolutely suggest you go there. I will drop a link down below. I'm not getting paid by them to tell you that. I'm affiliated with them only because that's where I learned, and it's still a great forum with tons of people that are still there willing to teach you. In any case, understanding your options, understanding the capabilities of those mills and what you really want will go a long ways to deciding what's the best sawmill for you to build and your cabin. And one last thing that I hadn't thought of earlier, and that is, where are you going with that sawmill? If you gotta pack it in by hand, then it's gonna be a chainsaw mill, because you ain't packing any other mill in. If it's a 4x4 trail, you need your Jeep to pull it in on, then you're probably looking at something like the LT15 Go on a trailer, because that's a light mill that would be easy to pull into the mountains behind your Jeep. Well, hopefully that helps somebody out, helps somebody make a decision on what sawmill to get. If you have any questions about sawmill, drop them down in the comments below. Ask me about it. I'd be happy to answer your questions. I love sawmilling, folks. Once you do, you get sawdust in the veins. It's difficult to get it out. And that's why you hear me saying all the time, I'm going to get back on my sawmill, because I love turning logs into lumber. There's just something about it that until you do it, you may not fully understand. But it's a beautiful thing. I hope that helps someone out. I'll drop another video right here for you to check out. Y'all have a great day. The old Jarhead out.